Well, good morning, my friends at St. Leonard's on the Hill in Red Deer. I am going to start this morning by reading two of the passages that I'm going to refer to. So I'm going to begin with 1 Kings, chapter 19, verses 9 to 18. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting the mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking after my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, and Abel-Meholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the word of Hazael, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Our next reading is from the Gospel this morning, and it's from Matthew chapter 14. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But early in the morning, by this time, the battered waves were hitting the boat, and the boat was far from land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." I wonder if you would just take a moment and pray with me before I begin. Loving God, grant us your wisdom. Allow our hearts and our minds to be open to your word. And may these words that I speak give you alone the glory. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, I wonder if any of you have had to run really fast, run away from something maybe, or toward. Maybe you were hiking and you saw a bear, or maybe you remember as a child playing in the street, and then a storm came and the thunder began to rumble and maybe lightning struck and you ran home. Or maybe you were in danger of missing a flight, and you were running towards the gate, kind of in a flurry, as we do when we're worried about getting on that flight. There is an energy, an emotional state, let's say, that we are in when this kind of thing happens. That rushed feeling, right? The verges of being anxious or being on anxiety. But it definitely includes fear, I think, right? Fear of losing the flight, fear of being eaten by a bear, not knowing how it's going to pan out, how it will all work out in the end, or how maybe we will get through a situation. We've all felt some version of that at some time in our lives, I think. And there seems to be kind of this feeling in the passages today, particularly in the First Kings and the Gospel readings that I just read. I think it might be a little helpful to have a little bit of background, especially for First Kings, or at least a reminder to those of you who might be more familiar. In chapter 18, which is just before this chapter we hear today, we hear about Ahab and his servant Obadiah. They keep seeking out Elijah. Now they meet him unexpectedly. And in that conversation, Ahab calls Elijah the troubler of Israel. Wouldn't you like that as a nickname? The troubler of Israel. Now, the irony of him calling Elisha that is that Ahab is actually really the one who causes Israel's distress. Now, Elijah proposes a contest with the prophets of Baal and Asherah. And this happens on Mount Carmel. So the idea of the contest would show who truly ruled Israel, right? It was either the Baals of Ahab and Jezebel or the Lord God of their fathers, right? Which is the God that Elisha worships. The contest consisted of preparing a sacrifice and then praying to their God to prove his existence by bringing fire down from heaven on the space that they had asked God to bring fire. So Baal, here's an interesting thing about Baal. The god of Baal is reported, or reputed maybe, to be the god of the storm. And so it does seem kind of reasonable, right? To think that Baal, if Baal is real, should be able to bring some lightning, cause a fire. Now the prophets of Baal pray all morning, right? There's no answer. Elijah actually is kind of nasty. He kind of ridicules them for their pagan theology as they're doing this. And then these prophets of Baal, they get a little frenzied. They slash themselves to get their God's attention, but there's no answer. So then in the evening, it's Elisha's turn. And so he rebuilds the altar, makes it much bigger, flushes it with water, right? So that it's going to be hard to build a fire here. He calls upon the name of God by saying God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. And fire falls down and takes over the entire altar. I'm imagining it's quite a scene. And all the people there cry out, "The Lord, he is God." Now the prophets of Baal, unfortunately, who are there, they actually get killed for this. And then God sends shortly after a rainstorm to end a very long drought in the area. Now, after all this happens, Ahab goes back to the city to inform Jezebel. That doesn't go very well. When Ahab tells Jezebel what Elijah does, she is furious at him, and she vows to kill Elijah. So this time, when we meet Elijah in chapter 19, Elijah has run away to the desert, away from this threat of death. He's in despair. He actually prays to God to let him die. Now, the angel of the Lord strengthens him with food as he travels. So as he's, running away from this threat, going to the desert, he prays and the angel of the Lord strengthens him, brings him food every day while he travels. He travels for 40 days and 40 nights, by the way. It's another interesting thing to notice in the passage. Now, he ends up at Mount Horeb. That's another name for Mount Sinai, by the way. Of course, that's where God reveals himself to Moses, right? So it's kind of an interesting little side note there. We hear Elijah in today's passage complain that the Israelites have abandoned God and that he is the last prophet of God, right? He says, I'm the only one left, God. Everyone else has left you in tatters. I'm the only one. God then brings a wind, a great wind, and then he brings an earthquake. That would have been nerve-wracking. And then a fire. And all of them are powerful. All of them are scary. All of them are dangerous. None of them are God. Elijah doesn't hear God in those events. Instead, Elijah hears God in the still, small voice, or the whisper that some translations call it, that happens after all the kerfuffle. We learn that there were, in fact, 7,000 who had not worshipped Baal, who were still faithful to God. And so then we hear God send Elijah to anoint 3 people who would ultimately destroy Ahab's house, right? Hazael of Aram, Jehu of Israel, and the prophet Elisha. The call of Elisha is, of course, the beginning of a large school of prophets. So then we get to the gospel. We hear the story of the disciples. We see Jesus go off after a long day to pray and to rest. The disciples go ahead of him in the boat to sort of meet him at another spot. In the dark of the night, a storm rises. And because of the geography around the sea, this is a very common occurrence, actually. Something the disciples would no doubt have experienced before. Now, Jesus begins to make his way over during the storm, amid the storm. They see him and they are terrified. They think at first he's a ghost, right? And no doubt, I mean, the anxiety that we feel in these situations and the energy of dealing with the storm, right, is not helping them to not jump to conclusions. You know, I always feel a bit, not protective, but certainly defensive of them. This is a big deal, right? Their boat could go under. So imagining something being sort of the worst case seems kind of like a normal reaction in a sense. Jesus speaks. A quiet voice in the midst of a massive storm. Remind you of Elijah? Take heart, he says. It is I. Do not be afraid. Now, Peter does a double check. Peter's a practical one. If it is you, Lord, command me to come to you on the water. And Jesus answers with one word. Come. As long as Peter keeps his eyes on the stillness, the peace, the strength of Jesus, he's fine. When he, like Elijah, focuses on the storm, the earthquake, the fire, right? The water, right? They're not seeing God at all. They're seeing the blustering nature of nature, right? They're seeing the problem. It's interesting that Elijah claims there is no one but him left as a prophet, right? And God gently reminds him in the passage, actually, Elijah, there's 7,000 left. And it's interesting also, isn't it, that Peter initially heeds the call to come when Jesus says, come to me. But then he becomes frightened by the noise of the waves and the wind and begins to sink. It's interesting also that God is recognized in both passages as being truly God. In the gospel, it's stated as, truly you are the Son of God. And in 1 Kings, in the lead up to today's passage, those watching, right, the fire be struck, the Lord, he is God. In our psalm today, we hear just one little verse in it. The psalmist says, or asks rather, let me hear what the Lord will speak, for he will speak peace to his people, to his faithful, to those who turn to him in their hearts. You know, I wonder what part of our lives is in a storm today. What part of our experience is uneasy or just downright difficult? How might you and I, in the midst of these storms, earthquakes, fires, seemingly impossible situations to solve, how might we turn our attention, listen to what the psalmist says, for the Lord who will speak peace, we will hear. How might we turn to hear the voice of Jesus gently saying to us, come? Or how might we be invited today to hear the truth of a situation in the still, small voice, to know the promise that we are not alone, as Elijah thought he was? Sometimes we believe that too, don't we? But there are 7,000 others, God says to Elijah. Who might be those people for you when you're feeling alone? What might you do to invite that still small voice in the midst of moments of torment, of storm, and of challenge? Let me invite you today, friends, to walk in the shoes of Elijah, of Peter, and thousands of others. Feel what you're feeling. Acknowledge the truth of the situation, the hardship, the difficulty. But reach out for the hand of Jesus. Ask God to speak. Expect him to be faithful, to respond. But don't be surprised if it's in the small, gentle, quiet invitations of your life. I'm inviting you to make space for that quiet. May it be so for all of us. Amen. you.